pile it up like those piles of peppers.
Yeah.
Well, it's that, but also, I quite like that notion. And to me, that's a very, it's almost an ethnographic approach, right? Which is why I'm quite sympathetic to, right? You know, the point of that kind of research, and again, to me, it's not design research; it's research about design, right? Which is valuable, good stuff to do. But even the way you played it up, I think it's again this very humanities-focused idea of developing these kind of thing descriptions, right? And perhaps look for some notion of patterns and resonancies and commonalities. But that's different than the approach of trying to create a sort of generalized theory of design activity, which I think is probably not straight. I would hope, to be honest.
Right, I agree with, yeah, I'm with you. I think where we might arm wrestle a little bit is around the
Is that
is it's not very satisfying if every design context is extra special and brand new. I'm looking for language that helps us see regularities across different places. And what impresses me about Donald Schoen's view of this is that he's able to generate this epistemology, these concepts that seem quite general, but in their act of unfolding in the design, they can play out in really different, specialized ways. That's the piece that has a lot of intuitive value.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Again, I mean, and where I would go, let's do it. The person I go to here is like Latour and Network here, and I think he does a really nice job of laying out this idea that you do have these specialized contexts. There can be meaningful, rich description of those. Those contexts and those descriptions can be in conversation with each other, and that might be enough, and that might be all that you really need, and that you may not need to kind of go to that next level of generalization, being that one kind of theoretical framework that accounts for everything, right? And in fact, it makes the stronger case at times that in fact it's counterproductive to try to do that because you lose sight of the thing that you're actually studying.
So this is something I encounter a lot in the conference world, which is that people are really so happy and safe in that higher level that everyone's throwing around jargons, and in the end, the actual design work is really boring. And really, at the end of the day, when we talk about ethnographic approaches, design is just human intention. When you're doing a research, you're looking at how people are designing their environments, their surrounding, what they really want, essentially. What you do, say if you design a probe, is you're having a calm conversation saying, I really want to find out about you. And this is what you guys mentioned before. How do we ask questions without just blatantly going there? And then so it's more like a, design is an etiquette. Is a way that we frame what we intend. But it's also really nice that we can theorize it, as long as we don't end up having all these, I used to work in a lot of design agencies that would have all these brightly colored slogans that were driving people crazy, even toilets. And that's something that kills design.
I'd like to ask a couple questions. So what happens if I use my very best inspiration and design something really beautiful that nobody wants? From a perspective of design, what do we say about something like that? Or let's say that I have some really great inspiration about designing trains and how they run and move from place to place, and can do so in a really marvelous and smooth way. And they're being used to bring people to concentration camps. What will you say about my design? So, and I think that there's a really important distinction to think about, which is, when is somebody doing art? When is someone engaged in something that is self-expression of some sort? And when is someone engaged in a different kind of activity, which is an activity about changing the world with intention, which is maybe my personal definition for design. And then, if you go there, who are you designing for? when can you answer that and say, well, I'm designing for myself, it's my inspiration, and I have some personal vision of the world, and that's what I'm going to do, versus saying, well, I'm designing in the world, and a lot of people, the people who are going to live in that building that you're talking about, the very way they live and experience their lives, and Dave's talking about tools, you know, how you feel about yourself as a person, and you construct your own identity, and all of that stuff is at stake. So then is my personal inspiration, is that, how far does that get me? Or does something else have to come into play? For us to engage in, you know, if we are innovators, if we are changing the conditions of the world, how do we look at that relationship? So maybe that's a good place to throw things out to the panel. That's good. Look at what I get to do is I just lob it back. You know?
Stuart Brand spoke on campus 1,000 years ago, I think. It's far enough ago that my little gray cells aren't real sure. But he had a metaphor that he used to describe change in the world, and it was an onion, and it had to do with sort of the difference between clothing as design for clothing style, which can change next month, and design that influences cityscapes, and design that potentially influences sort of change at the geographic level. And each of those carried a different kind of ethical responsibility for consideration of impacts, and because they're persistent in different ways. And one of the things that Ben, Helen, and I talked about a little bit yesterday was the notion of design and ephemera. And some design is completely ephemeral because it's on a piece of paper, you can wad it up, throw it away. But some, your train system is going to have big impacts on lots of people, and those live in different worlds. And you know, beyond being two expressions of intent, they have ethical connections that we have to consider in terms of evaluating. Does that address the question, or is that just a dodge?
Can I ask? So you would never ask this question, right?
Which one?
About that you have this trait, because you would always go from the people first. No? Personally, I mean,
would I never start from a technology?
From the train perspective. So, and also, well, so technology is different from just the train of technology, right? Because it's the whole context that is going to, you said concentration camp. I mean, actually, when you said this, I just thought, well, we have a high-speed rail train that takes all of England right to London. Like, you know, some people would argue that essentially the technology of it, or the you know, it could really be separated by the sentiment of it. But the sentiment of it would have to listen to what the actual context is, the people, what was. We start from, you know, this whole thing about HCI is that it starts from the human first. So, you know, where and when, you know, maybe during the Second World War you would have a market, but whether or not you want to do that. And now, well, maybe there's no market to do that, but there's a market for the technology. So it would, I think one side is that the technology itself can be stripped from all the intention for what this design is. But on the other side is that the intention for the design completely relies on the one word, where, what, how, why.
So are you asking me?
Actually, I was asking you personally. Obviously, never stop from a train.
So I think they all belong together. I don't think that they're so inseparable. I think that they're some really interactional kind of thing. But I think it is, for me, there's something very different from asking the question, what is my personal inspiration on something? And going into a situation from the perspective of inspiration. So I'll tell you another example that to me, I've spent a decade or more thinking about, because I think it's really fascinating.
I noticed.
What?
No, sorry.
What?
It's okay. It's okay. Just a little whisper.
a little, it's probably really interesting. You probably all want to know what they said. So someone went into a community somewhere in Europe actually, and they did great kinds of data collection, like gave people postcards and said when certain things happen, respond to these prompts, and people were really generous with really intimate things, and I think it's sort of a sacred space kind of view. So this is the place where, you know, these kinds of events happened in my life, and all of this intimate, really revealing, really heartfelt data, and they got mounds of it back, mounds of it. And then the designer's approach was to read through it all, and they picked one that kind of they liked. And they did a nice design around it, admittedly a nice design about it, but all of these other human beings and all of their humanity was just kind of brushed under the table. And that, to me, feels problematic. Like, if we ask people to bring, to share all of that, where then our commitments to them for having elicited that?
I think that's a fair point, and I'm willing to say that's a shitty project. But I do want to respond to the question itself you asked, because you made this move that I think is a very common move, and it's one that I want to call out, right? Which is you set up this kind of choice. On the one hand, we have personal inspiration, right? And that you dismiss as art. I would say it's maybe underdeveloped notion of what art is. I don't know if you can believe it, but you said it. And on the other hand, we have this idea of we are designing in the service of others, and that's design. And we're doing what they want us to do, right? And this, to me, I don't think you mean this, but what it points to, it's actually, I think, a very common way of constructing these things, particularly in HCI. And what I think it points to is the fact that the HCI community has never known what to do with designer agency. So my response to you is that personal inspiration, personal decision-making, and along with that, personal ethics and responsibility are absolutely on the table and in the mix in every single project, right? It's in some ways, I think about the kinds of design work as a negotiation between, on the one hand, the intention, needs, desires, and fears of the people we intend to be designing for, the intentions, desires, needs, and fears of perhaps our clients if they're in the mix, as well as our own. Right? And any particular design project is going to be some balance of those three. Is it possible to do lousy work? Yeah. So you can do projects that have absolutely no bearing on anyone. So you might make a beautiful thing that no one wants. The word for that is failure. And we understand that concept, and we're very happy to point it out when it happens. Right? So I don't think there's a huge problem here, but I do think it's worth thinking about what happens when we, and here I'm thinking more of the CHI community in particular, when we try to theorize designer agency out of the equation to the extent that we sometimes do, what are we doing to design practice, and what are we also doing to any kind of notion of ethical responsibility on the part of that engineer or that designer, right? And I know, given what we do, people are on the same page with this, but that would be the response.
It's his response to this kind of challenging question.
It's just getting fun, but I'm the runner. Thank you so much, Danielle. It's wonderful to see you there.
So maybe the one thing I would say to that, and I think it is really interesting and important, is, and sort of to speak to Tad, is that I often hear designers talk about inspiration and stop there, and not talk about a broader range of things. And so I would say in the work that I do, we talk about the designer values, which would map onto inspiration. We talk about the project's explicitly supported values. So in coming to a particular project, there may be something that you're trying to achieve there. And then we talk about stakeholder values. So all of the people who are affected directly or indirectly. And the proposition is that you have to account for all of those. So in a very specific project working on, with Alan Borning and computer science, working on large-scale urban simulation, the project's values were around democratization of the urban planning process. So, and when you look at stakeholder values, there are a lot of values around economic development, there are a lot of people who have environmental values. That's really complicated, contested space. And then we had these designers over here, and it just by a fluke, the designers tended to all cluster around having environmental values. So how do we balance that? We can't let our own values kind of run roughshod over all these other stakeholder values, especially because the project's commitments are to democratization. So maybe my point more is that to be aware that there are at least these differences in our design process, to be really explicit about those. And different projects may resolve them in different ways. They may say for a particular project, actually, the way we're casting the project, the values of the project is to actually just reflect the designer's values, and that's okay, as long as it is transparent. That would really be more of what I would say.
I agree, and I think, then to bring it back to the topic at hand, I think one of the questions we can talk about is how do you take the experience of that project and how does that inform then the next thing you do and the next thing other people get to do? What are the mechanisms through which the specific learnings that you have about how to surface those values, right, and make them a topic of discussion, right? That's a research question.
You go back into Donald Trump's mentoring cycle.
Right. That's one model.
The-
That's one model,
Yeah.
right? And maybe not the only one, but certainly it is one. That's one kind of model, right? Playing cards, right? As you guys have been doing, like that's another model and approach. Again, the only thing that I would suggest is like, I like the approach to knowledge production that says let's let 1,000 flowers bloom here, rather than let's try to figure out the ideal best way and try to then get everyone in the design community on board with either Schoen's model or your model. Right? And that's where, again, when I start thinking about sort of the kinds of the kinds of work that we, sort of broader intellectual enterprise, want theory to do for us, that's where I start to think about drawing some lines, right? Theory or more abstractions that allow us to see commonalities across different instances, but real practical actual examples of things, good, but once you kind of lose that connection to your point, I think we're in some other, it's another world that I think we do well with.
But I think it's quite interesting, that for academics, like how you deal with this, so that each one of the students are going out into the industry, and there is kind of, at the moment, there's this almost pressure for designers to be almost like how we'd say a tradesman. You can do a door, you can do a chair, you can put yourself in anywhere, and there is a sort of an older sort of system of having, well, this designer, he does this kind of thing, this is their spectrum, no, sorry, you don't really do, do my sort of thing, but I know Bob over there, he'll do your chair. But at the moment we expect such elasticity of designers that they should be able to be sort of pulled out of any job and placed into another one and dive straight into it. And I think I'd be interested to hear about the sort of pressures you guys must have to train for that spectrum, or to teach students that have to, cope with that in this.
It's all done with Kool-Aid.
That's reassuring.
They have to choose which flavor they want. That's what major selection is. And that's
I just wanted to comment before you move away from the topic of theory and design and how you may or may not want to use it, or how you folks are or are not looking to it for guidance. One of the distinctions that we've been making in our class, which I think we've talked about as being a helpful distinction, and actually the way this discussion is going, makes me think, oh yeah, this really can be a very helpful distinction to make, is that we've been talking about research through design, that's the title of our class, but we've been talking about also research for design and research on design. And what it sounds like is comparing and conflating a lot is all three of those different types of research involved in research for design, which would be the kind of thing that you were talking about primarily in sort of CAD, and research on design, which is Schoen, and then research through design, which is more like the speculative design that you're doing. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that there are different ways of breaking down these different kinds of activities that can be really helpful, particularly in conversations like this, when people coming at design from different experiences and different angles are trying to get on the same page about, that's all.
And also on the topic of theory, when you brought up art, what immediately springs to mind is that there's probably lots of artists and designers and researchers who all think that they're affecting change. And just one of the questions, so